All right, so today we're going to look at the third session called the Ecclesia Anglicana, which means the Church of Angels. Anglicana means angel in Latin, so the Ecclesia Anglicana is the church in England. And by way of reminder for last week, we've been talking about a couple themes, because again, you can't cover everything from the creation of the universe to today in 6 weeks. I'm trying to stay on some themes. If you recall from session 1, we talked about that God works through covenants. Remember that? And that means that no matter what people did, God's promises were fulfilled. And last week we talked about this idea of apostolic succession, which I would submit to you as part of the Catholic faith. Apostolic succession takes the place, in a sense, of the covenant of the Old Testament. It is the way that God assures his people of sacramental validity and the church functioning despite human brokenness. Does that make sense? If it doesn't, think of it like this. A bishop or a priest in apostolic succession, which I would be one, can consecrate the sacrament and pronounce absolution and do all the ministerial acts necessary to care for a congregation, no matter what he thinks. So a person can be a raving, loony heretic. He can consecrate the sacrament and pronounce absolution whether he believes it or not. Why? Because it's not about him. It's about this idea of apostolic succession being the guarantee of sacramental validity. It doesn't guarantee teaching validity. You can be a raving heretic and have apostolic succession. Is that clear? But it does guarantee sacramental validity. We'll get into that a little more today. Don.
After last week, the whole apostolic succession thing, what happened with both the split Church of England, they had Church of England and Reformation, because it couldn't have been...
We're going to get to all that stuff next week when we talk about the Reformation. And let me just say this, because when you get into the idea of churches like the Presbyterians or the Methodists or the Lutherans in some cases, who just sort of dispensed with or didn't make essential apostolic succession, what do you do with that? That's a very good question. We're going to get to that next week at the Reformation, though. Okay. By way of reminder, bishops are in lineage of apostolic succession by the laying on of hands, right? It takes 3 bishops at the very least to make a new bishop. The reason you have 3 is in case one of them have deficiency in orders. And originally from last week we talked about, in the beginning there was only one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. So the Nicene Creed, written in 325 to 385, in that period of time, when it talks about one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, it was a real thing. Since the split, which we're going to talk about today, that's changed, but we'll get to that in a moment. And then finally, and this is really important, the church made decisions gathered in ecumenical council. That is crucially important. When all the bishops of the world would come together before the Great Schism in 1054, they would meet as a group and they would make decisions on things like the divinity of Christ, what books were in the Bible, the Nicene Creed, all sorts of things, infant baptism, all sorts of stuff. They were made during the first 7 ecumenical councils of the church, right? So how do you have one now that the church is broken apart? We'll get to that in a minute. Any questions so far? Am I going too fast this morning? I'm actually pretty energetic despite my lack of sleep last night. Oh, I wanted to show you this. I know you can't see it, and maybe it looks like beef stroganoff. I'm sorry about that. But this is, anybody ever seen one of these before? This is and if you want a copy, I'll give it to you. This is a copy of the Apostolic Succession for the Diocese of Central Florida. So if you look here, you'll see, you probably can't read it, it says Jesus Christ. Right there. And then it has the 12 apostles, and it traces through the lineage, Bishop of Ephesus, all the way through to William White. We're going to get to him later. William White, who was the first bishop of the Episcopal Church. He's over here somewhere. And then here at the very bottom is Gregory Orrin Brewer, who is our current bishop. Point is, we can trace, and again, I'll give you a copy of this if you'd like. Actually, all the American succession works the same way because we all come through William White, who we'll get to later, consecrated in Church of Scotland. But if you go through the whole chart here, it's pretty cool to see that there's actually a lineage you can trace all the way back to Jesus and the 12. So, in case you didn't believe it, there it is.
You can trace yourself too.
Yeah, well, actually, you could. So I would trace my own orders. I was ordained by the priesthood by the Bishop of Central Africa. It's a long story, but he was through the Church of England. So his would have been his lineage wasn't through William White, which is the Episcopal Church's thread, but he would have been through the Church of England and then into the Diocese of Central Africa. So I'd be over here, I'd be in here somewhere. So anyhow, good stuff. All right, so we're going to move on. So the church initially was one holy, Catholic, and apostolic, right? Apostolic succession was the guarantee of sacramental validity. Bishops met in councils to make decisions. And then, kaploom. That's a Greek word, which means to go crazy. Actually, thank you for that. In 1054, the Eastern Church and the Western Church split into what is known as the Great Schism. The word is schism, by the way, not schism, in case anybody ever asks you. And the Roman Catholic, at one point, and originally was the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. That was it. We saw a picture of that last week, remember? And then it broke into two halves, and either side excommunicated the other. So the Bishop of Rome excommunicated the Archbishop of Constantinople, and that's the rest is history. Of the original 5 patriarchates, the 5 primary dioceses of prominence in the world, only Rome was the only one in the Western Church. The other 4 were in the Eastern, which we later would call the Eastern Orthodox Church. Why? Well, good question. And again, it's got some political stuff, and I'm really, really oversimplifying. But this is a pretty good representation of why the split occurred. Changes in the date of Easter. So, well, I'll get to that and why it's important in a minute. Addition of the filioque clause, right? Who proceeds from the Father and the Son. That little "and the Son" is not in the original creed. And then finally, the Bishop of Rome began to assert his, what you could call primacy, meaning he was over the other bishops. Okay? These are actually all related items. Anybody figure out why? Anybody know why the date of Easter, the addition of the filioque, and the assertion of the primacy of Rome are all under the same cause? Money, probably. Control. Remember what I said, that the bishops... What's that? Calendar. The bishops would gather an ecumenical council, right, to make decisions, like the date for Easter, or the words of the Nicene Creed, or the limits of authority of a bishop. Okay? So, when the Roman Catholic Church, or the Church of Rome, I should say, decides to change the date of Easter, the Orthodox, well, everybody else goes, wait, you can't do that. That's the decision of a council. When they add the filioque clause in the Church of Rome, the Latin Church, everybody else says, wait, you can't do that. That's a decision of a council. And when he says, well, all you bishops are equal except for me, I'm now a bishop over all the other bishops, they say, wait a minute, you can't say that. That's a decision of a council. Do you see my point? What's happened, it sounds subtle, but it's actually hugely important, is that the Bishop of Rome and the Latin Church began to assert itself over and against all the other bishops in the world. Why is this important? Because you'll see when we get to Anglicanism in a moment, we always hearken back to the church before the Great Schism as the way we do theology. Any questions there?
How big was the Roman diocese compared to the rest of the Eastern?
All I know is I don't know numbers, but there was the church, the Diocese of Rome was one. The other 4 patriarchates were in the Eastern Church. Interestingly, though, part of the problem in all this, because again, politics and religion always are tied hand in hand, nothing like a church fight, like they say, right? During this period of time, if you know your history, the Moors were conquering vast swaths of territory. Islam was going through and laying waste to large parts of the world, including most of the eastern part of the empire. So when not only were they being converted by force, if necessary, by Islam, the Western Church had the military power, the Eastern Church not as much because of the influx from the Moors, from the Muslims. And then when the Eastern Church appealed to Rome for help, Rome said, no. And so Constantinople, which was the headquarters of the eastern part of the empire, was sacked by the Muslims. And if you look at, everybody look at the I don't know what they call it in Islam. They call it something. It's got a great big dome on it in Constantinople. It's a mosque. The Hagia Sophia was the original church that the Muslims then converted into a mosque. But it was originally the cathedral church of the Diocese of Constantinople, the whole Eastern Church. Like, what's the basilica in Rome, the big one? St. Paul's. It's the equivalent of St. Paul's. but it has currently got a crescent and not a cross on top of it. Anyway, so let me segue a little bit here. So the church breaks into two big chunks, okay? Where it ties in for Anglicans is we come out of the Western chunk, right, as you'll see in a moment, but we actually believe in something which is important. Let me back up. So in the Roman Church, I'm just going to call it the Roman Church, and the Orthodox Church, or we'll call it the Eastern Church. When they break apart from each other, they excommunicate one another, right? Which means they are excluding them from the church, basically kicked out of the church. So the Roman Catholic Church understands itself as the church, right? Right? So the Eastern Orthodox Church considers itself the church. Okay? There's a word you need to know. It's called ecclesiology, which is a long word for how does a church understand what it is? Okay? Who it is. Okay? So this is important, actually, because Anglicans offer a different alternative, which you'll see in a moment. The Roman Catholic Church would say, we're it. Right? The Orthodox Church would say, oh, no, we're it. And historically, they probably have a little more basis for that claim, given the fact that all the councils back them up for the most part. Anglicans say, we're not it, but we're part of it. Does that make sense? It's a brilliant, and you're going to see why in a minute. So the Roman Catholic Church says, we're it, and the Eastern Church says, no, we're it. Neither one of these two recognize each other. There was a meeting not too long ago between the Bishop of Rome, a.k.a. the Pope, and the Bishop of Constantinople, the Patriarch of the Eastern Churches. They met for the first time since the Great Schism. It was 1,000 years ago. So, nothing like a church fight. And those wounds run deep. But the important thing to see is that the Roman Church considers itself the church. The Orthodox Church considers itself the church. Anglicans say, we are not the only church, we are a part of the church. And the theory which this comes from is something called the branch theory. Anybody know who that dashing young fellow is? No? His name is John Henry Newman, and he was an Anglican priest who eventually poped, went to Rome, became a cardinal. Man, they scooped him up like a golden bar. He was a big Anglican in the Church of England and a proponent of he has a book called The Apologia of the Church of England, defending the faith, and he became a Roman Catholic, and they were very happy about that. He always regretted it, though, actually, if you read his memoirs, because we've got better music and liturgy. It's true. So the Catholic Church splits into two pieces. The Reformation leads the Anglican Church to leave Romanism. We're going to get to that at the Reformation next week. But what we see here is what Anglicans would call the branch theory. Has anybody ever heard this before? The branch theory looks like this. You probably can't read it, but you don't really need to know the details of it. This is the early church, right? It's only one. Council of Ephesus, Council of Chalcedon, Nicaea, and all those are in here, okay? Then you have the Great Schism in the 11th century. This little purple branch over here is the Orthodox Church that went to like China, and they were considered not part of the church early on. But for our purposes, the Great Schism is right here. You see the blue and the red? And so what you see here is the red, which is the Western Church, and the blue part, which is the Eastern Orthodox Church. They pretty much, the blue part, if you notice, they don't split. They don't split. They never have. The Western Church, after the Church of Rome split from the rest of everybody else, and then you have that carried along until the 16th century, which we're going to get to next week, known as the Reformation. Now, what Anglicans believe in is the branch theory, is that because we maintain apostolic succession, right, we are a branch from the root. In other words, and it all hangs together logically. If the church was at one point one holy Catholic and apostolic, and it broke into two pieces, right? The two pieces both claim to be the church. Both of those pieces maintain apostolic succession. When the Church of England later on separates itself politically from the Bishop of Rome, the branch theory maintains, we still maintain that we're part of the church, but not the whole thing. Is that clear, everybody? Let me give you an example. Anybody here of the Vatican Council? Yes or no?
Yes.
Vatican councils?
Yes.
Okay, a Vatican council, let's come back to this a minute. The Vatican says, or the Rome says, we are the church. So what they do is they have things called Vatican councils. And what a Vatican council is, and their idea is an ecumenical council. Right? Because they're it. Or I don't think the Orthodox have had any more councils since the seven original. But the Church of Rome claims to be the church, and therefore the Vatican councils are essentially ecumenical councils where they can make definitive decisions. I'll give you an example. Does anybody here know that in the Roman Catholic Church you must believe in the perpetual virginity of Mary? Did you know that you must believe in her Immaculate Conception? You must believe in the infallibility of the Pope. Those are all decisions by Vatican councils that are binding for salvation on Roman Catholics. That's a huge. No, any of those three things could possibly be true, but if you come back, if you know your history, the only way you could make those decisions is to have an ecumenical council where everybody was together, which can't happen right now because it's blown apart. But the idea being, as an Anglican, what I would say is big things like that, the perpetual virginity of Mary, all sorts of different things, can only be decided by an ecumenical council, which right now isn't seeming too likely. Is that clear, everybody? So ecclesiology is actually really important, how a church understands itself. Romans say, we're it. The Orthodox say, we're it. Anglicans say, we're part of it, but we're not the whole thing. We would say that we would appeal again to apostolic succession, that those two pieces are part of it, that we are part of it, that some Lutheran grades are part of it. What about people who have left apostolic succession? Talk about that next week. But we would say, we're not it, but we're part of it.
Did the Eastern Church fall out of apostolic succession?
No, they maintain it. Yeah, the Romans do, the Orthodox do, Anglicans do, some branches of Lutherans do, Swedish Lutherans do, Old Catholics, that's another whole thread. So there's a bunch of different ones. I've got a bunch of questions. Marilyn?
So predicated upon what you just said,
Mm-hmm.
the Eastern Church was correct when it stated that the papacy did not have the right.
Okay, Marilyn's question is that's a really good question. Marilyn's question is this. Was the Eastern Orthodox Church correct to defy the Roman claims of changing the creed, changing the date of Easter and Roman primacy? And as an Anglican, I would say yes. In fact, I would say in a lot of ways, this is going to sound funny, but in a lot of ways, Anglican theology is very close to Orthodox theology in substance. Our liturgy is definitely not Eastern Orthodox, but our theological method is, which Rome wants to define every little thing. Orthodox and Anglicans are a lot more comfortable with mystery, mysterion, and the idea that a big thing like those big ideas can only be changed by an ecumenical council. And in fact, I'll make it salient to an issue of current division in the church of women's ordination is a big deal, right? The Roman Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church have said no. Well, they've actually didn't say no. They said we can only make this decision in an ecumenical council. And so the Anglicans have said, well, we're going to do it anyway. Some places have. And so the question is, well, on what grounds? And so it's a whole realm of what do you do? Well, two things. What things are necessary to be decided by an ecumenical council? Point one. That's a big question. And secondly, what do you do with groups that have decided to go a different way? So it's a big issue. It's a big issue. Yes, Martha? Sorry.
I just am having trouble seeing the words on the far right. I see rest.
Don't worry about it. Don't worry about the details. It's just
I just need to write them down. Could you just read them down quickly?
I'll give you a copy of that that's bigger. How's that?
Okay, perfect.
You're going to Restorationism, Anabaptism, Protestantism, Anglicanism, Catholicism, Miaphysite. Don't worry about it. I'll give you a copy of that later. Okay. Yes, Janie.
Has there been an ecumenical council since
No.
Vatican II when John Paul was?
Well, that would actually, that's a very good question. The Anglicans and the Orthodox would say no, because you can't have an ecumenical council without all the church gathered together, right? The Romans would say, but we are the church, therefore Vatican II was an ecumenical council. There hasn't been one since. No.
Since the split or since the first one?
since Vatican II in whatever that was, 62. Thank you. Raleigh.
The
Yeah.
date for Easter is determined by what, the first full moon after the
I don't know, some crazy
spring
formula.
equinox,
Yes.
and that was set. And why did they feel
It's
that?
the first Sunday after the first.
First Sunday after the first
Right.
full moon after the spring equinox.
Why was picked that day and why they changed it, I don't know. The point is, what I do know,
Different. I mean, you can check that.
who knows? But the point, I mean, again, the details aren't as important as the big picture, which is the Western Church asserted a change in something which everybody had always assumed could only be made as a matter of a council. And so the question becomes, well, can you change the date of Easter outside of a council? Can you ordain women outside of a council? That's the question, right? Those are the big questions. But again, if you looked at the earliest church's understanding of itself, the council was where big decisions were made. So, and the branch theory says that Anglicans, again, all you need to know that we're not it, but we're part of it. And what holds us onto the branch, onto the tree, is this idea of apostolic succession. Is that good? All right, let's talk about the conversion of England. You may not know this, that the church in England, and I use that term importantly, we're going to talk about the church in England and the church of England. Because right now it's the church in England. It's not distinct from the Western, from anybody. In the 4th century, which is before the Great Schism, there was a guy named St. Alban. Some of you, anybody here belong to a St. Alban's church somewhere? They're all over the place. St. Alban was a Roman soldier in the 4th century who was ordained to the priesthood and served in England. There were 3 British bishops at the Council of Gaul, which is not an ecumenical council, but is a local council. So in 314, which is before the split, before Nicaea, actually, the bishops we know were British bishops were gathered together in this council in France, in Gaul. Bishop Constantine, St. Augustine of Canterbury, in the year 597 was made the Archbishop of Canterbury, okay, by Roman appointment. See, and interestingly, Rome begins to assert, because Rome had an empire, or the remains of one, but began to assert authority over the church in the West. So the point, this is an important little 250 or 300 years here, because in 314 in Gaul, the church was still pretty decentralized. By here, in 597, Augustine is appointed the Archbishop of Canterbury by the Bishop of Rome. And you see here, I have here, the English church comes increasingly under the influence of the Church of Rome. When I say the Church of Rome, I mean the church with, the Roman Catholic Church. Is that clear, everybody? Okay. And actually, let me back up on that for 1 second. If you are new to the Episcopal Church or Anglicanism, you will frequently hear people refer to the Roman Church. When I first heard that, I thought, that's weird. What is that? But again, let's come back to the ecclesiology question, okay? Is the Roman Catholic Church the universal church for all humanity? If you believe that, you're in the wrong spot, okay? Frankly. So we refer to it, the Anglicans will refer to it as the Roman Church, meaning it's the church headquartered by the Bishop of Rome. We refer to him as the Bishop of Rome, usually not as the Pope. It depends. I mean, you don't want to be antagonistic about it, but the Bishop of Rome, we'd say, or the Eastern Church. Okay? So again, back to the church in England, back before the Great Schism. There's a guy named Aidan of Lindisfarne, who was an Irish monk who brought Celtic practices to the church in England. The Synod of Whitby in 664. That's a household idea, right? In 664, again, not too much longer after Augustine is put in Canterbury by the Bishop of Rome. In 664, the church in England submits to Roman decisions and councils. That's a big deal if you're an Anglican. Okay, because the church, but notice something important. Until 664, the church in England had actually been quite distinct from the Church of Rome. And there was a whole liturgical practice, there was spirituality, all sorts of different things that were not all completely distinct, but were nuanced, right? They were English and not Latin. And there was an Anglican distinctiveness in organization and liturgy. Anybody here ever wonder why we use blue in Advent and not purple? If you ever notice, we use purple for vestments in Lent, but we use blue in Advent. And the reason is, in England, there is a cathedral one of the cathedrals has something called the Sarum Rite. The Sarum Rite was an English rite. I mean, it was legit. It was, the prayers are all legitimate and accurate, but they would use blue as Advent rather than purple in Lent. And so a lot of Anglican churches will continue to use blue in Advent, for example, as a liturgical distinctive from the Church of Rome. You'll never go to a Roman Catholic church and see Sarum blue, I guarantee you, for Advent. Does that make sense? And then again, not a big deal, but the point being that the church in England was distinct in some ways, but increasingly came under the authority of the Bishop of Rome. And so the question becomes, fundamentally, what is the authority of the Bishop of Rome? What is his authority? And this is an important detail because the authority of the Bishop of Rome will actually have influence on the later Reformation. James.
Yes, I think part of the deal, my understanding is that the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Bishop of Rome had a huge amount of temporal political power at the same time.
They did.
Not just religious, almost all the governments were more like theocracy.
Well, and in fact, and it's, yes, Jim's point is that the archbishops of Canterbury, the religious authorities, had a lot of political power. It's actually an interesting distinction because if you were to go back contemporarily to them, they wouldn't see a distinction between theological and political power. The English had something called the divine right of kings, and this actually comes right out of Scripture, where Paul says, be subject to the civil authorities, for they are put there by God. The idea being that the monarch was actually the head of the church, not in spiritual matters, but in temporal matters. And in fact, that's true not only in England, but all of Europe. The Queen of England currently is the head of the Church of England in temporal matters. She's not ordained, obviously, but she has a high degree of authority in terms of, well, maybe not so much anymore, but historically they did. And actually, that's a very good point. When we get to the Church of England next time, and Henry VIII and all that debacle, everybody thinks that, well, what Henry was trying to assert, and we'll talk about this next week, was that the Archbishop of why is Rome telling Henry he can't have an annulment, which it was what he asked for. He didn't ask for a divorce, but an annulment, probably on justifiable grounds. But he says, well, wait a minute, why am I appealing to the Bishop of Rome for an annulment when the Archbishop of Canterbury is the bishop whose jurisdiction I reside? And that is when the whole thing came to a head, and again, the split occurred again. But actually, when you get to this next week, the Church of and the Anglican split, again, why did it split? Well, the assertion of the authority of the primacy of Rome, just like in the Great Schism. Stuff circles round and round, doesn't it? All right, any questions or comments there? Nothing? Am I throwing too much at you? Okay, so we're gonna go through the Middle Ages very quickly. In the Middle Ages, as you know, Rome falls. They are overrun by the Visigoths and the Germanic tribes and so forth. Rome falls. Europe slides into feudalism. So basically, when central authority fails, Rome was all about centralized authority and power, right? That's what made it so prosperous. Once that fails, what happens? People go into feudalism, little sort of tribes and city-state kind of idea. Interestingly, you may not know this, people will frequently look and say, well, the church has always tried to suppress truth and suppress free inquiry and suppress knowledge. Nonsense. In the Middle Ages, the monasteries were actually where you went to become educated. The monasteries were the smartest guys and women, in the case of female monasteries, where they lived. And monasteries were pivotal to the Middle Ages because that's where learning and science and mathematics and all these different things were actually were maintained because central authority had broken down. Yes, Don.
Most of the orders, the Carthusians, the Benedictines, the Trappists, etc. Because I've actually been in the original Carthusian monastery, which was in 1066.
Yep.
So was it
Right.
about the same time?
Absolutely, yeah, but right. Yes. So Don's question is, what about these different monastic orders that were formed in the 11th century, 1066 and onward? You're exactly right. After the Great Schism and the Great Schism happened at the same time as the Visigoths and the overrunning of the Roman Empire. It all ties together. So civil authority breaks down. The church begins to become more powerful because the civil power has diminished by virtue of being invaded. And these monastic communities begin to spring up as a way to maintain learning and Christianity in the context of a culture which has fallen apart. There's actually a very good book out. I haven't read the whole thing yet. It's out right now, called The Benedict Option. Benedict was a guy who started a monastery called Benedictines. And the author of the book says that Christianity in the West is under such assault, and Western culture in general under such assault, that the church has to be prepared to go back to that model. I'm not so sure I buy his premise, but it's an interesting thought that, the church has always been in the West anyway, part of the culture, right? I mean, our Constitution's founded on a Christian worldview. As that continues to erode, this Benedict option is the idea that, maybe we ought to just form communities of people to maintain each other in the context of a culture which is just going haywire. I don't know. It's an interesting idea. Another guy, by the way, named St. Francis, who's 12th century, decided, Francis, by way of sort of a slight sideways mark here, he saw the monasteries become very wealthy, very powerful, and he said, well, wait a minute, if we're going to be cooped up in these monasteries, who's going to preach the gospel? And so what Francis did is he started an order of brothers and another group of women, sisters, that would go out, and they were actually go out and they lived as a rule of life, but they didn't live in community. They would go out and they would live amongst people. Different sort of thing. Yes, Jim.
I was taking a course on the fall of Rome not too long ago, and one of the things they said that precipitated the Germanic tribes coming south was the climate changed dramatically in northern Europe, and actually it was so cold that the Rhine River froze.
Oh, yeah?
For the first time, and probably hasn't since. So it's easy for the people to migrate.
Right. So Jim's comment is that during the before the invasion of the empire, the weather, global warming,
It's actually a mini ice age.
forced people south. That the Rhine, that makes. I mean, all these things tie in, right? And these things are, cultures change by all sorts of different reasons. But the point I want you to see here to wrap up is that the monasteries maintained Western thought and actually lifted some stuff from the Muslims, like algebra and some things they came from during this invasion period from the East. The monasteries continue to grow. The Western church becomes wealthy, right? There's no centralized authority to maintain things anymore, so someone's got to make the money. The church becomes corrupt, increasingly corrupt, and that eventually leads to the Reformation, which we're going to talk about next time. So, conclusion, the church was, in the beginning, one holy Catholic and apostolic, episcopal form of church governance maintained via apostolic succession. You guys see me beating this drum a lot? It's important. The church, according to the Anglican understanding, the church is currently fractured into pieces, but survives in pieces or in branches, you might say. And the thread amongst those branches is this idea of apostolic succession. What do you think? I think that's all I've got for today. I got 5 minutes for questions. Anybody have one? Yes, Alan.
Yes, maybe you covered this last week, but what is the biblical basis for succession and also the branch or any?
Okay, that's a good question. There are lots of ideas. I had the scriptural references last week.
It appears to me that you have on your branch, right? You have the branch, and the Bible kind of ends, and then you have kind of the
but see,
branch.
good point. Okay, so in the Bible talks about the Bible talks about apostolic succession and councils. For example, when Matthias is elected by vote to replace Judas, because Judas betrayed Jesus, they needed a new apostle, a new bishop. They gathered, look at it, it's in Acts chapter 5 or 6, where they gather together, they elect Matthias by vote, and they lay hands on him. Right? When Paul would leave, 2 Timothy, somewhere in there, when Paul would plant a church, Timothy, he would lay hands on him as a presbyter, priest, and give him the authority to do these things. So it's not just a later evolution, it's actually biblical. And in the book of Acts, when they were trying to decide about food laws for Gentiles and things, the church gathers together in council It says apostles and elder, which is the word presbyter, priest, and they met in council and argued and prayed and came up with a statement called the Council of Jerusalem, which talks about what they're going to do with Jewish food laws for Gentiles, which the answer was they don't have to follow them. But it's in the book of Acts. My point is, this is not something which came on after Scripture. It's just that and again, you can't think of it as this book fell out of the sky. It didn't. It was in an environment of people that used Scripture and you continued the methods used in Scripture later on. Am I answering your question?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Alan. Paul.
Paul, was he ordained by some of the apostles, or was he just considered chosen?
Paul was met with the other brethren. He talks about this in Acts as well. And yes, he was also ordained. Recognize, it's interesting, Paul claims to have had an authority, a call given to him by Jesus directly. But they recognize his orders. It's I have to look it up, and we can talk about this sometime. Maybe we should do a class on that. Anything else? I'm just looking at sort of global ideas here. Am I helping you? Have I challenged anybody to think a little differently? Or at least consider? Yes, no?
Yes.
Okay.
It
Don.
does seem, though, along the way, like the Vatican Council said, the unity of there, and as we split into other forms of apostasy, we kind of choose what we decide and try and go back and base it on a biblical position.
Is it self-serving? Is that what you mean? Yeah,
At times,
I understand, but we're gonna. And again, that sword cuts both ways. I agree with you. Can you go back as an Anglican, as an apologia for your own view, and say, well, the apostolic succession is historically verifiable? I mean, you can prove that, but is it necessary? Well, I would say I don't know. So I would say, what did the church always believe about that thing? And if you look at church fathers and read about it, that's what their conclusion. It's interesting, too, when we look at the Reformation next week, people like John Calvin believed in apostolic succession. Martin Luther believed in the necessity of apostolic succession and the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. It was the people that came after them that kind of pulled away from it. So we'll get to that next week. It's a good question, though, and it's a valid criticism. I would just say, for me personally, if you do your research in history, you have to come to the conclusion that the church always believed that. So, okay, 1 second.
Just a point, when you were talking about the patriarch of the Eastern Church and the Pope meeting recently.
Yes.
They said the Nicene Creed, but they said it in Greek, and the Pope did not say.
Yeah, that's a good question. So her point was that when the Bishop of Rome and the Patriarch of the Eastern Church met, they said the Nicene Creed together, and the Pope omitted the Filioque. There's actually a movement in the Episcopal Church to omit the Filioque as well, which I think is historically justifiable. If you, yes, sir. Okay, that's a good question. In the Nicene Creed, we say we believe in the Holy Spirit, the Lord and Giver of life, who proceeds from the Father. The Filioque is who proceeds from the Father and the Son. Philios is the word for son in Greek. So the Filioque clause, who proceeds from the Father and the Son. The and the Son is the Filioque clause. It's not in the original creed as decided on by the Council of Nicaea. It was added later by the Roman Church. We inherited it as a result of that, but it's not in the original. And it's a huge bone of contention between the Orthodox and the Romans, not because of the words themselves, but because what it shows you is where does your authority lie? Can the Bishop of Rome make unilateral decisions, or do these decisions belong in the context of an ecumenical council? That's the problem. Good question. Okay, I got a minute and a half. Yes, Lynn.
The Apostles' Creed is said in a lot of other Christian churches.
Yes.
They never say the Nicene Creed.
That's right.
So when did the Apostles' Creed come about?
You know, Charlie Clippert asked me that question, and I told him I'd look it up, but I never did, and I don't know. But I'll find out for you. Google it. What did we do before Google? Yeah, the Apostles' Creed predates the Nicene Creed as far as I know, but I don't think it was ever validated by a council. I think that's the difference. There's actually another one called the Creed of St. Athanasius. Anybody ever read that? It's in the back of the prayer book, and it's a whopper. I mean, it's long. And it actually says, for anyone who must be saved, he must believe the Catholic faith. And it lays out all the decisions of this in this creed of St. Athanasius. I used to read it on the first Sunday of Lent in my former parish, and I almost got fired for it. So, but it's in the prayer book. Anything else? All right. Thank you, folks. Hope you learned something. All right.